Ministry partners are like your teeth. If you take care of them, they'll last you a lifetime. And it can sometimes feel like, man, there's a lot to manage in ministry partner relationships. But yeah, I just am so convinced of the importance of that care for ministry partners.
Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Welcome back, everybody. On this podcast, because our backgrounds are primarily in overseas ministry, it's easy for Heather and I to think in terms of vision casting and mobilization for a global context. However, it goes without saying that many of our listeners are working in and fundraising for domestic ministries. Principally, there is a lot of crossover, and many fundraising skills do translate across domains, but it makes sense to take time to examine some of the distinct challenges and advantages of domestic fundraising. We'll be talking about support development in the U.S. today, so if you're listening from beyond our borders, there is a chance the specifics may not strictly apply. Shout out to our global listeners. There may be a need to contextualize, but presumably the broader takeaways will fit within your home country as well. Heather, would you please do the honors of introducing our guest today?
Absolutely, Andy. So today, to speak to this very important topic, we have with us Carolyn Kellam. We crossed paths with Carolyn at the Fundraisers Conference last spring, and she works with the Navigators out of Denver, Colorado as their manager of staff fundraising. So before this, she actually lived and worked in Boulder. For those of you that don't know, Boulder is a college town, home of the University of Colorado Boulder, and it is really not the most affordable place to live. If you follow college football, this is where Deion Sanders coaches. So not only is she responsible for her own living and ministry expenses, but she also bears the responsibility of helping all Navigator staff in their funding, a tall order. So, Carolyn, what else do we need to know about you or your role?
Yeah, so in addition to this, I actually also sit on the leadership team for our IEdge program, which is a 2-year commitment overseas. But kind of at the heart of all of this, one of my favorite things in the world is just helping equip people, helping to train them. In both these roles, I love emphasizing and talking about our Father who longs to be gracious to us, delights in us, and is our provider in a number of different ways.
Very cool. And how long have you been working in support-based work?
Yeah, so I have been support raising for almost 8 years. And then I've been on our Ministry of Partner Development team for just over 2 years.
Okay, wonderful.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to start us off here, Carolyn. What did your initial launch into support raising look like? Did you receive training? What was your view on support raising as you were getting started? And I'm curious to know how that has possibly evolved.
Yeah, so the biggest shift that's kind of happened when I came on staff with the Navigators, I really viewed fundraising initially as kind of this means to an end. Like, it's fine to do, but it's just so that I can get to actually doing my ministry on campus. I started collegiate ministry. And when I first came on staff, my parents weren't super excited about the idea, primarily because of the fundraising aspect.
Sounds familiar.
I think it's a pretty common experience, and I really don't fault them for it. You know, it just was foreign and unfamiliar to them. But I think all those things together really made me feel like I wouldn't have probably used the words necessary evil, but in essence, that's kind of how I viewed it, of it's just this obstacle to overcome so I can get to real ministry. Today, I would say that support raising is one of the greatest joys and privileges we get to experience as gospel workers. And even my parents too, the Lord has just done so much in their hearts, and they're really eager about my fundraising process, being on my team, helping others to know about it too. So I'm really grateful for that. Yeah, I just love that the Lord invites us into partnership with other people, that we don't have to go at it alone. My initial launch into support raising, I did receive training. The Navigators have a really great training. And I was so thankful to go through that with my class of people who came on staff at the same time with me. Some of my best friends in the world I met during our funding school together.
Cool.
And we've just stayed in touch during our careers.
Very cool. We had opportunity to have Scott Morton on the show last season, I think it was, and it was a really wonderful conversation. And I'm pretty sure that much of the training you guys have kind of corresponds with the resources that Scott has provided. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Scott laid so much of the foundation for what the Navigators do in support raising right now. And I'm so thankful to get to stand on the shoulders of giants like Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, another thought that came to mind as you were just kind of sharing with us a little bit about your journey is, so I'm reading a lot in the Old Testament right now, specifically in the Torah. So specifically like Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all that jazz.
Did you also just start a Bible reading plan?
No, actually,
that's my excuse.
I'm preparing for a women's retreat, so it's just got me in those books. But it just occurs to me, so the wilderness, like I feel like the people of God would have been like, yeah, I'd rather skip the wilderness and just kind of go to the promised land, right? Like the wilderness seemed like, I don't know, something that's like, yeah, I'd like to sidestep that, maybe the necessary evil or whatever. But it's like, man, how would they have been formed for the promised land had they not had the wilderness? Had they not had time after time after time of God showing himself to be a creative provider, manna, water from a rock, deliverance through a sea. I mean, it's just incredible. Right. And so, I don't know. I feel like throughout time, there's these experiences that feel like we can start to view them as the necessary evil. But then on the other side, we're like, oh, wow, actually, that was a really important part of my formation and preparation and a very unique way that God showed up. So I don't know. It just seems applicable.
What's that old adage? It took a while to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but even longer to get Egypt out of the Israelites.
Oh, I haven't heard that, but yeah interesting.
Yeah. So maybe there's something about that in the process, the length that it takes us to get kind of formed and fundraised and kind of reshaped.
Yeah, maybe so. But anyways, that was just something that came to mind as you were talking about that, because I think a lot of people view it, maybe not in those words, but just kind of view it as like the means to the end, but don't see necessarily the beauty until they're kind of like looking back at it.
Yeah.
So from your perspective and experience, what do you think are some unique benefits and maybe unique challenges in raising funds for domestic ministry?
I think one of the greatest challenges in raising support for domestic ministry is especially in the United States. I think for a long time, Christians have kind of been primed for international giving and viewing missions as just something that happens outside of the US. It's like all of those people need Jesus, but we're set here. And so I think that can be a real challenge, is helping to reframe domestic work as also just as important mission work happening here around us. On the flip side, I think one of the greatest benefits is just getting to have a team and to be even closer related to them in proximity than when you raise support overseas.
Absolutely, yeah.
Obviously, that's not always the case. I think there's certainly exceptions to that. But I love getting to have a team. I think that is one of the greatest privileges in ministry, is knowing I'm not alone in it. And sometimes I think about this picture of getting to heaven, right? So I have my ministry, and I have this whole team of supporters who are with me in my ministry. And sometimes I think about getting to heaven and these supporters who have helped make it possible for me to minister to people on campus or overseas or whatever the context has been, getting to meet people who I've talked about in my newsletters or email updates. Sometimes I just think about that reunion, and there's a lot about heaven that's really mystifying to me, and I don't want to speculate what all it will look like. But when I allow myself to kind of run with this idea, I think of some of my ministry partners like Mark and Cindy or Georgia, getting to meet. One semester on campus in Boulder, I had a Bible study with 5 different Emilys, all spelled 5 different ways.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
I love that.
So I think about like Mark and Cindy or Georgia getting to meet one of the Emilys and being like, "You're Emily," and then being like, "You're Georgia." Like, I know who Jesus is because you got to invest in Carolyn's ministry and she got to share the gospel with me. And so I met Jesus on campus. And it's just fun for me to imagine what some of those reunions will look like. I think gospel workers who raise support all get to experience that. But I love that being domestic, I have more opportunities than overseas staff sometimes to get to meet with them for coffee or to send them a note because postage is a bit cheaper.
Sure.
Things like that. I just have more opportunities to interact with my partners in ministry.
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, with that proximity, does it ever feel like a tension you have to navigate because you are, physically in proximity to people, and so maybe there's an expectation there that there will be maybe more presence or more meetings, and do you ever have to navigate that, or has that worked out pretty well for you?
More demands on you, maybe?
Maybe. Or expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Especially in my earliest years of ministry, I think I felt like I really had to prove myself and what I was doing to those who were investing in my ministry, especially financially. And again, I don't know that that feels exclusive to domestic laborers, but I think it can really feel like, especially if I'm visiting a church where I know there's a broad base of supporters, something like that, it can feel like there's a real tension there of like, and I really need to engage. I need to make sure they're up to date on what's happening in my ministry, that they feel like they have what they need to feel like this is a worthy investment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Carolyn, you've been raising funds for yourself for over 8 years. Right?
Almost 8.
Almost 8 years. Okay. I'm curious to know, what are some of the key strategies that you've picked up or developed over the years? And then how have you actually helped staff to keep their support accounts balanced? How have you contributed to that equation?
Yeah. So for myself, I would say the biggest strategy I've picked up on is that communication with my ministry partners is absolutely critical. And that can happen in a number of different ways, whether it's through a physical newsletter or an email update or just a phone call. But I've found over and over that the more I communicate, the more invested my ministry partners are in my ministry. And when I start to let communication slip, often my ministry partner support also slips. Someone on my team has this phrase she always says. She says, ministry partners are like your teeth. If you take care of them, they'll last you a lifetime. And I think it can, even talking about the demands, it can sometimes feel like, man, there's a lot to manage in ministry partner relationships. But yeah, I just am so convinced of the importance of that care for ministry partners in communication, in letting my needs be known, but also allowing them to express their needs to me. It's just been such a privilege to get to pray with my ministry partners, pray for them, get to hear what's happening in their life has been such a gift to my heart.
So let's say you're sitting down in front of somebody that you're training and it's their first time and they're like, well, what does that look like? How do I communicate? Should I just post on my Insta?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a number of ways you can do this. You could probably ask 100 people and get 100 different answers to this. But my best tip for this would be figure out a healthy rhythm of communication. And this is even going into the question you asked about how I get to help staff keep their support accounts balanced.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say creating regular rhythms of MPD work or ministry partner development work is really critical. So in the Navigators, most positions that are fundraised, all field positions are fundraised, but most of them in the job description have the fundraising percentage somewhere in the ballpark of 10% of the job description. And when I first came on staff, I remember thinking like, okay, I'm working 40 hours a week. That means I should be spending 4 hours per week on MPD. How do I fill these hours? What does that mean? Do I just need to be spending 4 hours writing a newsletter? What all goes into this? And I had a campus trainer sit down with me and help me really understand this in a way that became so much more helpful. And he said, Carolyn, it's more helpful to think about this 10% over the span of a full year. So instead of 4 hours every week, that might not even be necessary in some moments. But think about, okay, once a year, I probably need to dedicate a certain number of weeks or a certain amount of time to raising additional support.
Okay.
And then looking at that on maybe a monthly basis, it's like every month I need to probably sit down and write a newsletter. And then a subset of that newsletter, I would say this is like my key tip, would be in your newsletters, you should be telling a compelling ministry story. Talk about what the Lord is doing in your midst and how the people who are partnered with you are helping to make an impact on your specific ministry. So that's been really pretty revolutionary to me to think about that 10% of my job description being spread over a whole year instead of feeling like it's a burden that every week I need to figure out 4 hours still with MPD work.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like within that, communication is just varied, peppered into in-person conversations and maybe on Insta and newsletters and really just preparing well to keep communication going in those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question for you. Okay, so if each skill in fundraising, so like communication, vision casting, follow-up, all those wonderful skills that we can develop, if they were like an actual tool in an actual tool belt, and you could only give your staff 3 tools to work with or to start with, maybe, what would those tools be?
I love this question. So I would say my 3 tools would be 2 asks and 1 follow-up.
Okay.
The 2 asks would be a financial ask that's really specific. So something like, would you prayerfully consider joining my team at $200 per month? That's my first ask. The second ask, or the second tool in my tool belt, would be for recommendations. Something that absolutely transformed my MPD a few years ago when I got training in how to do this. And it's how I've built and maintained my support team ever since. And so I ask the question in every MPD face-to-face appointment I have. I say, who are 3 to 5 people who would be encouraged to hear my story? I really emphasize that because I don't want people to feel like I just want them to give me their friends who can give me money, or that there's going to be this burden that I'm putting on people they're connecting me to. But I really am convinced of what the Lord is doing in my own ministry. I'm convinced that the Lord has really sweet things in store for those who invest their finite riches here on earth, that there's something good for them in heaven. And I want people to get a chance to hear about what the Lord is doing on campus or as I train staff. I want people to have a chance to hear that. So I just ask, who are 3 to 5 people who'd be encouraged to hear my story? So that'd be my second tool. And then my third tool would be 1 follow-up call. In my fundraising appointments, I always ask people if they would prayerfully consider giving. I just gave you the example of $200 per month. And then I ask for a time that I could follow up with them. I don't want them to feel pressured to make a decision on the spot. And I really do believe this is a spiritual thing that they need to be taking to the Lord. And so I want them to do that. So I usually ask to follow up 2 to 3 days after I meet with them. I set a time to make sure they're going to be free. And then I follow up with them. And if I'm really honest with you, that is the hardest part of fundraising work for me is making the follow-up call. I still get nervous about most aspects of fundraising, but that is the part that makes me the most nervous.
Mm.
Yet it's one of the most important tools I think a missionary or anyone raising support can develop.
That's great.
Yeah, that's great, because I think the reality is that time gets away from people, and they might have the intention to follow up with you or to let you know the conversation they've had or the decision they've come to or whatever. But your urgency is not their urgency. And other things come up, and, maybe their kid breaks an arm, or maybe, they all come down with COVID, like whatever it might be. I think that it's so helpful to have that follow-up call. Because I think it shows intentionality. I think it shows care, and practically your urgency is not their urgency. And so they might really have a heart to give and just forget, or, it might just get on the to-do list, pushed down and down.
In your experience, do most people really need that time? I mean, how many people come to a support meeting with a number and a yes already in hand?
It has certainly happened. But I would say, at least in my experience, most people do need some time to consider and ask the Lord. Or sometimes if they do come with a number, I've had it where people come of I'm going to give $50 a month. And then I ask for $200 a month. And they're like, man, I really need to take this to the Lord and pray and see. And sometimes $50 a month is what the Lord has for them. And sometimes it's more. But I think the other thing I really love about that ask is that I can trust that the Lord is providing for me and is using them in interacting with them. So it's not just me and this person in the equation.
Totally.
So real quick, Carolyn, I'm curious, how your asking has changed from year 1 to year 8. You mentioned $200 a month. Did you start off asking that much, or have you kind of worked up to that?
Yeah, I started by asking for $100 a month. And when I went to my first training, I'm very much a type A person. So if you tell me to do something, I'm going to do it. But when I was in that first training and they told us we needed to ask for $100 a month, I kind of wanted to throw up. I was like, there is no way I can ask people to give $100 a month. That's insane. And then to my amazement, it was something like 85% of the people I asked said yes to $100 a month.
Wow.
So it was amazing that, the Lord just, obviously the people training me knew what was possible, but also the Lord just made a way where that was possible. I switched to the $200 a month ask just 2 summers ago, and I had done this big data project for our team that summer, and the results were saying asking for $200 a month might actually be a really strategic ask. And so I decided to try it and to see what might happen. And similarly, the Lord just opened doors, and a number of people started joining my team at that $200 a month mark.
So people weren't offended?
No one was offended.
Yeah.
Which is just good to point out.
Well, I think people are afraid of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't want to offend people by asking too big.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories about this, I get to train staff, all new staff who come into the Navigators. I get to do their fundraising training. And that is one of the greatest privileges to me. I love it. It's one of my favorite things I get to do. But I always tell them this story because it's been so impactful for me. And I don't know if it's a true story or not, but I think the point of it is what really matters. So there's this story that when Alexander the Great's daughter was going to get married, Alexander the Great said to them, like, go set a budget and then tell me what you need and we'll have this wedding. And so they went out, they set their budget, and then the fiance of, Alexander the Great's daughter came back and was talking to Alexander the Great's right-hand man, gave him the budget. And this right-hand man went back to Alexander the Great and said, sir, they've given you a number. Alexander the Great is like, oh, I can't wait. Tell me what it is. And the right-hand man says, I can't tell you, sir. It's so offensive. It's such a large number. I just can't tell you what they've asked for. And Alexander the Great says, no, you need to tell me. So he hears the number. And then Alexander the Great says, no, you misunderstand. They've actually honored me twice by asking for this money. Once, because they know that I am quite wealthy, but two, they believe me to be quite generous. And so they would ask. And I just love that. I love thinking about how can we honor people twice in our ask. Obviously, we don't want to presume upon their income or their ability to give. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think we have a real ability to honor people by believing them to be generous.
I really love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I talk to so many people who think the opposite, who think that I'm going to offend people by asking too much. So I think it's really important for people who hear this to begin that process of rewiring that way of thinking. I think that's really healthy. It's great.
Yeah.
I was also talking to a couple just earlier this morning who I'm leading through some coaching, and they are in a unique situation where they have both been on the field in different scenarios previously, and now they're going back to the field as a married couple with 2 kiddos. And one of the things that he said struck me. He said, yeah, when I was first out of college, I had a different relationship with money than I do now. And when I was first out of college, asking for $100 a month was just like that amount of money was mind-boggling. But now that he's kind of lived a little bit, grown up a little bit, had a full-time job, he just appreciates when people come to him with a vision that he really cares about. He wants to be involved in that, and he wants to give more. So I think that's encouraged him to ask for more this second time around.
Yeah,
that's super encouraging.
So Carolyn, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you find accountability to be in the support development world?
I would say it's like an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. I think it is absolutely critical. But I also think it's really important to understand that accountability kind of happens at a lot of levels, I think, during a support raising season. So I think it's important to be accountable to your heart and your emotions and your thought patterns. I think it's important to be accountable for your spiritual state and how you're going before the Lord. And then, of course, it's important to be accountable to your actual tasks of what you need to be doing in your MPD work. But I think sometimes people can just get hung up on, I have to be accountable to make my phone calls or to have appointments. And I really am convinced that accountability goes deeper than that, because if we're not accountable to our thought life or what's happening in our heart or on a spiritual level, odds are our to-do list or the tasks that we're supposed to be doing aren't going to be done to this extent that they should be or the quality that they should be.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I just feel like you might be a person that finds yourself doing support-based work, but you are a person, and it's important to be aware of what's happening. As you said, be accountable to yourself, your emotions, your mindset, things like that. Do you have any practical ways that you encourage people to be accountable to themselves, whether that's like journaling or having somebody they meet with and answer questions with, or
enlisting a roommate?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of those are fantastic. We encourage all of our staff when they're in a season of fundraising to have some kind of coach, whether that's through one of our programs that we offer to our staff or if it's just on their own. but that coach would be someone who could ask, of course, about their to-do lists and their tasks, but also be someone who can kind of set things aside and say like, okay, just tell me, how are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in your heart? How are you experiencing life right now? What are you learning in your quiet times? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Carolyn, to ask you about some of the differences that you see, or how would you approach coaching someone who is raising money for a short-term trip versus kind of like a career choice?
I would say in general, if you're raising support for a short-term trip, it's going to be a lot more kind of short-sighted. So the vision you're going to be casting is for a pretty limited amount of time. And that's not bad. That's actually really good because that's what you're committing to. But I think it's really important. I would say the similarity in both of them is helping the person you're meeting with understand the vision of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest difference, I think, would be the time commitment for that. And then what follow-up and communication with these ministry partners looks like. Again, on the short term, it's probably going to look like a thank you note once their gift comes in, and then a newsletter once you've returned from your short-term trip.
Yeah.
Whereas long-term is going to be, again, it's critical to have that vision, but there's going to be a greater emphasis on your long-term communication. Of course, a thank you note when the gift comes in is still going to be super important, but then updating them regularly on stories that's happening in your ministry and helping them to understand why this investment really matters.
What about in the field of accountability? Is there anything
Sure.
practical that you can do with accountability for short term?
Yeah, I think most of the time in the short term, you're going with teammates. Always, but often. So I would say engage with your teammates. Can you guys commit together to a few things? Can you commit? Even my first short-term trip I ever took, my team leader had us, we were fundraising together, but she had us memorize scripture together and long passages of scripture because she was like, this is what's going to help sustain us. And so that was a way we were accountable to each other. We were accountable to the scripture we were memorizing. We were accountable to our phone calls. We were accountable to a handful of actionables. But really, I would say if you're going short term, really press into that gift of teammates.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. I remember you saying that you are still really close friends with many of the people that were in your cohort from your own fundraising training. And I think that Navigators does its training in cohorts, correct? It's not one-off, but with groups of people. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. So have you ever had situations that you're not forming a cohort based on people entering training at the same time, but more a cohort or bringing people together because they just are all fundraising? Or does it always happen kind of at the front end?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite things we get to do with our veteran staff in the Navigators. We offer these, we call them sprints, and they're 5 or 10 weeks that our staff specifically focus on fundraising for a set number of hours per week. And these sprints we also do in cohorts. So it could be people all across the country. We've had people participate around the world. But we've found over and over, people say fundraising is one of the loneliest things you can do. And so we've really tried to prevent that from being an obstacle. So we bring people together into cohorts of 3 or 4 people, and they could be from a number of different missions. They could be serving in a number of different states or countries. But the thing they have in common is they're all working to raise their support in this season.
That sounds like such a fantastic idea. How encouraging and motivating.
Really does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Carolyn, what do you see as the top barriers and obstacles for your domestic staff and for those who work in support-based ministry in the domestic context?
Yeah, I mentioned this before, but I do think one of the greatest challenges in domestic work is that Americans primarily are primed for missions giving being something that happens overseas.
Yeah.
And so then the obstacle becomes for staff, they really have to nail their vision. If they don't have a proper vision of their work and how the work contributes to the greater kingdom, the people they're meeting with for sure aren't going to catch that vision.
Yeah.
And because they've kind of been primed for international giving, they're going to be far more likely to seek out or just give to someone who comes to them from one of those contexts instead. So, yeah, I think I just can't emphasize this enough, but I think it's really, really critical for domestic workers to have a clear vision of what the Lord is calling them to and help articulate that to the people they're meeting with. The Navigators, we love discipleship. That's one of our key heartbeats. And I think this is a way, I think discipleship happens in a number of ways, but I think this is a way we can help disciple the capital C church is by helping people get a proper vision for what ministry looks like, not only internationally, but also domestically.
Yeah.
Well, and I even wonder, I know that Navigators is such a well-established mission, within the world context. I know they're not just in the States. It's not just domestic ministry.
Right.
But I'm just curious, and even watching how our home culture has changed, how America has changed, how the church and those that would identify as believers has changed over the past, 10, 20 years. I'm curious whether you guys are seeing a shift at all in people being more concerned about what's happening at home, more concerned with domestic ministry and the local college campus. And if you even just ever so slightly see a shift happening there or not quite yet.
Yeah, we definitely saw a big shift during COVID. I think, again, it's so funny to think about how the news or culture around us can really just prime us to give in certain ways. And so in 2020, we saw a huge uptick in giving to our domestic work, especially. And I think that was at play of people were really primed to consider like, man, the world's kind of falling apart. These are unprecedented times. How can I help? How can I be part of this? And so when a staff would come to them and make an appeal for monthly support, they were like, yeah, of course, I'll do anything to help. Especially when there was, for example, Bible studies happening on Zoom for college students who had gotten displaced from their dorms or were trying to figure out the meaning of life now that their college career was kind of in limbo, not sure what was going to happen. Some of that is, some of it was just a peak and is kind of sloping down now that COVID is fading out of the spotlight as much. But some of it is also sticking. And like you said, people, I think, are starting to get a vision of what it really means to disciple a generation, what it means to start locally and allow that work to really spread out.
Yeah. And I wish I could remember what I was reading, but I was even recently engaging some content that was just talking about how many foreign-born missionaries are coming here to our culture because of the need for, even though it's it's not an unreached people, it's certainly an unchurched more and more.
Sure.
Yeah. And kind of like a familiarity with Christian principles, but not with the gospel. And so, goodness, I'm just so grateful for the work you guys do in discipling people. We would really love to provide an opportunity to celebrate with you what the Lord has done. Would you be willing to share one story of his provision for you or with those that you lead?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the beginning of this year, January of this year, I had the chance to spend a couple weeks in Asia to lead a training for a number of our international staff who have been on the field for a year. They've committed for at least another year. So we bring them together to kind of process and reflect on what this first year has been, see if there's any modifications that need to be made so they can remain healthy going into a second year. it's one of my favorite things I get to do is be a part of that team. And it was such a privilege to get to go on this trip. But I had a substantial financial need in order to make that happen. In addition to some other trips I was going on to help train and equip our staff. So all of this was coming together at the end of 2023. And so I decided to just make a year-end appeal for all of these trips in conjunction with one another. And it was a pretty large sum of money. And I was blown away. The Lord met the full amount that I needed to raise to have all of these training and support trips happen. And then I got to travel to Asia, meet with our staff from around the world. It was so encouraging to be with them. It was so encouraging to hear stories of what the Lord is doing in their lives, in their host contexts. And yeah, I just remember flying home from that and being like, wow, Lord, you really see me. You really long to be gracious to me. And thanks that I get to experience your kindness towards me as a father in tangible things like this.
Yeah, that is very cool. Andy and I talk about how we over and over hear stories of God's faithfulness and actually like him showing up and providing in really big ways. And it just never gets old.
Never does.
No, it's like on one hand, it's like, yep, I would assume God would provide. Like, yep, totally within his character. But then on the other hand, it's like, man, so cool. He did it again. Like,
but you did it in that way.
Yeah,
time.
And you did it there. Yeah, like our guests from a few weeks ago, they were sharing about how they just really needed like a new truck. And they just got a $40,000 check in the mail to get one. Like that's,
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you said, he sees us. He knows what we need and he delights in providing, you know?
Yeah. I remember sitting at my first training as a staff, as a navigator, hearing stories of the Lord's provision. And I said this all the time to my class coming in together. I was like, I can't wait for us to be together again and get to tell our own stories of how God provides. But I think there was a little voice in the back of my head that was like, but I'll just be hearing your stories. Like, I know the Lord will provide for me, but I don't know that I'll have anything crazy like this. And then, 3 months later, I was with some friends just telling story after story after story of these amazing things the Lord had done to provide for me, that the Lord had done to provide for them. And it's like you guys said, I will never get tired of hearing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think we're wrapping up here, Carolyn, but I think as our podcast boldly declares, we do believe it's not about the money. So I'm wondering, are there any scriptures or biblical stories that are your go-to for when you feel like you need perspective or grounding?
Yeah, I have several. One of my very favorite ones is 1 Timothy 5:17. It says, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. That was something the Lord just ministered to my heart so deeply in my first season of fundraising. Being like, oh, Lord, am I just a beggar? Am I like less than? I have this college degree, but now I'm raising support. And him really saying like, Carolyn, you're worthy of double honor because you are preaching and teaching a new generation. So I love that. I love in Luke 10:7, Jesus says that the worker is worthy of his wages. I love this is maybe a unique one, but one of my favorites is actually 1 Chronicles 29. It's most of the chapter, but it's the temple building. And I love seeing, this is my favorite part, is that you're right. It's not about the money. But in this 1 Chronicles 29, verses 1-16, we see David kind of orchestrating with the community around him to get everything necessary in order to build the temple. And I just think that's a beautiful picture, that the community would all contribute something so that there would be a space that the Lord could come and could dwell and they could meet him there. And I can get really caught up in thinking like, man, fundraising is this new thing, or it's like a 20th century idea.
Yeah.
But really, the Lord has had this idea of it since the beginning of time. We see it in the temple. But the model is still the same. The model is still that people would all contribute, in this case, to a ministry that then, as I go on campus or as I train staff, that's the ministry they've contributed to. But it's a space that still the Lord can dwell and people can come and meet and interact with our living God. And I just love that. And I love, again, this picture of community, that we're all together in it. I have this whole team of ministry partners behind me that are with me in prayer. They're with me in their finances. And so certainly money is a part of it, but it's not what it's all about. It's the community, and it's that people would get to experience the one true living God.
That's awesome. And I think even before that, like I'm going through a Bible plan as well, the Bible in a year. So I'm also in the Pentateuch. And you think of Moses asking for donations for the tabernacle and for all these new implements that they're building from scratch, right? And the fact that the people of Israel gave and gave and gave until they had to tell them to stop giving. Like, you've overgiven. So that's cool that even from the very beginning, like, this has been a model of like the community coming together for the purposes of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it.
Actually, community comes together, period. But I hope it's for the purposes of God, because I even think of like when they made the idol that they worshiped when Moses was on Sinai.
Yeah.
They all pulled their stuff together to make that.
It's true.
So I wonder if it's like a human thing to come together, but it's like, oh man, think of what that is in the Lord's hands.
Let's
versus
direct that to the right purposes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Just interesting. All right. So by way of encouragement, what else would you want to say to our listeners as they persevere in support-based ministry?
I would say that you are seen and you're not alone in fundraising. I understand the challenges. You're not alone. I see you. The Lord sees you, most importantly. But also, it's good and right to invite people into partnership with your ministry. It's a good thing, and it's a good invitation that you would have that.
And are there any resources that you would recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I'm sure many of these have been mentioned before, but The God Ask by Steve Shadrach was revolutionary to me in my support raising when I read that. Funding Your Ministry by Scott Morton is a fabulous resource, like everything you would need. And then I also really love The Spirituality of Fundraising by Henry Nouwen.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time. This has really been a lot of fun. Andy, do you want to
I'll
close
do the
this
honors.
out? Okay.
Yes, Carolyn, we have one question that we ask everybody. So kind of put you on the spot here.
Okay.
Suddenly you have $10,000 and you got to give it away today. Who or what do you give it to?
Yeah, I would give it to someone in the 1040 window, someone serving there. I studied abroad in the Middle East, so I have a huge heart for Middle Eastern missions, and that region would come to know and love the true and living God. If it was possible to find specific disciple-making communities where that was happening, I would love to invest it there. But yeah, I just think the Lord is really doing something special among people in that region, and I'd love to give there if I could.
Yeah, to be part of that.
And how cool that even in our domestic campus ministries, we had people coming from all over the 1040 window to our universities and campuses.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's such an incredible opportunity. I always tell everyone, I'm like, if you have a chance, connect with international students, invite them over for a meal.
And what even at Life Group this past Sunday, this topic came up about how people of other cultures are often much more open to discussing religion. Like it isn't that taboo subject that it is here in America.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially if you approach it with a learner's heart of wanting to hear from them also what they believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. We are really, really grateful for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a great rest of your day.
Yeah.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, you too.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.